Thanks, Jocelyn. Thank you, everyone, for making it so bright and early on Friday morning. Of course, I want to thank all my co-authors. All of this work is done collaboratively. A lot of people have been contributing and thinking about this problem. Of course, funding agencies as well. I'm actually pleased to see the talks before me because I'm going to try and weave a tale that starts out very broad and big-pictured motivation, akin to what Kevin was discussing, and then we'll try and get into the weeds a little bit with atmospheric transport, talking a little bit more about LiDAR observations, much like was just discussed in the last talk. So let's see. So first, let's talk real big picture motivation. I want to pose this question: why are observational constraints on anthropogenic greenhouse emissions needed? And kind of embedded within that is I'll pose the question, why is it fundamental science? So this week we've seen a lot of talks and posters, and there's a lot of emphasis on carbon monitoring, policy. Kevin actually made a pretty compelling case for some other motivations for urban studies. There's some simple efforts to really just try and quantify budgets in the carbon cycle. But one of the things I hope you walk away from my talk today with is the realization that uncertainty in anthropogenic emissions is really becoming a fundamental problem in carbon cycle science. So these other motivations are great, they're very important, but we need to realize that this is actually, it's important for us to tackle anthropogenic emissions to understand some fundamental questions in carbon cycle science, and let's see if we can convince you of that here. So let's talk about the airborne fraction. So quick refresher, airborne fraction, this is the ratio of the atmospheric increase in each year to the total emissions in that year. So this is simply the fraction of how much we've emitted from fossil fuels remains in the atmosphere. So this value, it hovers around 40%. So I'm showing from the Global Carbon Project some estimates of airborne fraction from 1960 to 2010. You can see it's hovering about 40%. There's a lot of interannual variability. It can be quite variable year to year. You can start to make arguments about whether there is a trend or not a trend present there. Obviously, this is very important if we want to understand future carbon dioxide abundances, if we start to have a significant change in what the airborne fraction is. On top of that, I want you to note that we've plotted on gray, it's the total 1 sigma uncertainty from all the contributing uncertainty elements, and in pink, I've isolated just the fossil uncertainty elements. I want to emphasize this is using just a 5% uncertainty on fossil throughout the whole time frame. It's not increasing in more recent years, even though we have some evidence to think that it might be increasing in recent years with the increase in emissions in areas where we have poorer bottom-up information. But what I want you to note is how that pink bar starts to expand and take over the whole uncertainty range. And on the bottom, I've simply plotted up the fraction of uncertainty encompassed in fossil fuels, and you can see it's starting to push past 80%. And what I'd posit here is really that uncertainty in fossil emissions is becoming a limiting factor in our ability to constrain the airborne fraction and really determine trends or changes in time. And remember, this is purely dictated actually by the increase in fossil emissions, because this is not actually increasing our uncertainty in fossil, though that may indeed be happening. So this is one kind of fundamental carbon cycle metric which is being compromised by uncertainty in anthropogenic emissions. Another is a kind of fun thing that's been really gotten a lot of attention more recently, and I think it was kicked off really Peter Cox's Nature paper in 2013, where he looked at the covariance of tropical temperature and CO2 growth rate anomalies to try and infer carbon-climate feedbacks, right? So this is really trying to infer fundamental carbon cycle ecosystem responses to climate change, right? And so what he did is he looked at this interannual changes in growth rate and in tropical temperature. So I've plotted on the left here, in black is the CO2 growth anomaly from 1960 to 2010. So that's that metric that was used in that analysis and subsequent studies that have been used. And you can see there's quite a lot of variability year in, year out. But what I've also done is over the same time period, just using fossil emissions inventories, you can calculate what a fossil anomaly would be over that same time period. And that's what I've plotted up in the blue line. And of course, this does not vary quite as violently. This does not change quite as drastically year in, year out, but it does drift up and down over time. And even more so on the gray band, I showed simply what the 2 sigma fossil uncertainty would be. Again, using simple 5% of the magnitude. So at 2 sigma, this gets us close to a petagram a year at current times. What you can see is, first I would say, if we're going to do these types of analyses to try and determine emergent relationships, we first need to remove fossil effects from the CO2 growth rate anomaly. So you need to subtract that blue line from the black. But you would need to be pretty confident on what the blue line is. And I would say that we're starting to really lose confidence at all in what that blue line variance is, and you can see it encompassed in there. So this is another impact of our increase in fossil uncertainty on our ability to look at some fundamental carbon climate feedbacks that we think are really important. So I thought it was important to step back a little bit and discuss this, because I think monitoring is very important, verification is very important, but really there's some fundamental scientific questions that are starting to be compromised, our ability to answer them are compromised by increasing fossil uncertainty. And so I think that's a whole nother motivation for a lot of these activities that we are here and discuss today. So how can we tackle this? Well, we're in an urban session right now, right? So let's focus on urban regions. You've heard in a lot of other talks and so on that, right, it's a large source of fossil emissions. There's a lot of emissions concentrated in urban regions. And so it can be a nice area to go and tackle this problem. So now I'm going to kind of try and quickly weave through how we might tackle this sector with observations and how can we maybe start to reduce uncertainties in some new and exploratory ways. So we'll briefly talk about space-based observations just because it's so tantalizing, and then we'll get into ground and we'll really get into the weeds talking about atmospheric mixin in LA, really looking at some LiDAR observations. So this is old, but this is good to start with. Right, this is, we demonstrated that we could see the urban dome of CO2 in Los Angeles from space. So this is using GOSAT data. You can see on the left is a nightlights image of Los Angeles. So the green is really showing you where all that urban activity is. And then there are GOSAT footprints over the city there in pink, and the desert in the red triangles. On the right, it shows simply the total column concentration over the course of pretty much 1 year. You see a seasonal cycle in CO2 on the top. The city observations are systematically higher than the desert observations. That difference is done in the lower right, and it's right about 3.2 or so ppm higher in the city than the desert. And we started to posit, okay, you can maybe, if you track this over time, you could potentially start to detect changes and trends. Well, as I said, this is from a couple of years ago. GOSAT's been up for a while. So now we have years of observations from GOSAT, and we can actually track this out over longer time periods. So rather than one seasonal cycle on the top here, you see many seasonal cycles. You see the city observations are in the more purpley color, and the desert this time is in more green color. Again, the city is systematically higher than the desert, as you would expect. We can do differences, and that's done here on the bottom. And you can see that there's some variability, but we don't see any obvious trends that start to jump out at us in any really statistically significant way. It seems to be pretty consistent over that time period. Now, what that means is a different question that would require more detailed analysis. But I wanted to point out simply that we've demonstrated we can see these domes. We can see some consistency over time. You can start to do some interesting analyses to infer things about emissions, but you also see there's time gaps in there, right? There's gaps where there's not really any observations in the city or the desert. It's very sparse observations. We're talking about essentially single points in the city and single points in the desert. So if we tried to infer something about emissions, we would be needing to conclude that that one point is representative of the whole city. That's not necessarily true. But we are hopefully going to be able to push past this with OCO2's launch. And there's some concurrent talks right now on OCO2, but OCO2 is looking really exciting, right? It successfully launched this summer. I show you 4 cities here, which Los Angeles, London, Paris, and Tokyo, which OCO2 will be making observations of. In red is the nadir track, and in blue it's the glint. So we'll actually be getting cross-sections through these cities in different areas, which might be really exciting. Now, this is just simulation, but we can actually look at what the real ground tracks look like from observations that were being made this past fall. So this is actually showing a nadir ground track that passed almost directly over Paris. So that's good. Paris is a city that's nicely outfitted for urban observations. And if you look on the right, you can maybe squint and see there's little squares in that yellow stripe. There's 8 squares across. So it's not only that we'll actually get a cross-section. Oh, thank you. So there's actually 8 squares across this track here. So not only will we be able to map out kind of the dome in this dimension, but actually we'll get part of it in this dimension too as well. So it's very exciting. No CO2 data with this day though, because it was very cloudy. So that'll wait to come. But we're very excited about this. As the validation exercises continue, we're really looking forward to being able to include this. So that being said, this will really improve our spatial temporal observations, our ability to push towards high resolution compared to just, say, the GOSAT observations. but it's still rather sparse in space and time compared to what we might really want in some of these urban regions. So if we really want to go to high resolution, we really need to use ground-based observations. And of course, this is where we start to really wander into this pile of atmospheric transport and how do we really deal with this and how do we uncertainties. So just as a quick refresher, right, if we use atmospheric observations to quantify fluxes, what we're doing is we're measuring some constituent of interest and inferring from this with other information on things like winds, sources, magnitudes, and changes in fluxes in time. And oftentimes, transport error is a leading source of uncertainty. And one of the things that we know, of course, is that the mix-in depth starts to become a real problem. This is a primary source of error. If you make a measurement in an urban region, the first thing you actually see is the meteorological dynamics of the mix-in depth. You see that primarily over actually the emissions dynamics. You'll tend to see higher concentrations at night than during the day, even though the emissions tend to peak during the day. So of course we need to get this right. So let's dive in. We've been making aerosol profile observations for a couple years now in Los Angeles. And this is with the Sigma Space Mini Micropulse LiDAR set up in Pasadena at Caltech. I've got a student, John Ware, who's done a real nice bit of work taking a look at this data and setting up algorithms to be able to try and pull out mix-in heights really nicely here in LA. So it's based on a really simple Haar wavelet analysis, which is illustrated on the left. So basically, you try and find when this wavelet matches the aerosol profile. So this is altitude, and this is aerosol, and you see there's high aerosol in the mixed layer. When it falls off here, we say this is a proxy for the top of the mixed layer. There's some other tricks that John's using here, and we're running things in many directions, and you can pick out clouds. So this is fog, actually, early on. But this shows what we would say is a typical day. It's a generous typical day, but you have some fog in the morning, it's burned off. You have mix-in layer growth throughout the course of the day, and it starts to collapse in the afternoon. Of course, LA is really nice for this because we have such high aerosol load-ins in the mixed layer relative to above, so it really helps us out. Now, this is a normal day, I said, but it's a clean normal day. Things can get more complicated. So this is a day where, again, actually there was some fog in the morning, so we couldn't see above, but then it burns off. You see there's all these aerosol layers above, there's growth, there's entrainment. And the algorithm's doing quite well even on complex days like this, and I say, oh, it's doing quite well, and you say, well, Eric, how do you know it's doing well? This looks like a mess over here. Well, it's nice because we actually had SONs launched throughout the course of this day, and I'll just show you a couple examples where we actually measured the meteorological characteristics. So this is showing altitude, and then this is showing the different variables plotted here. So blue is the aerosols measured by the aerosol LiDAR, and you can see the mixed layer algorithm picks out a mixed layer here, and it's over here on this. And then we see potential temperature and relative humidity. And you can see these meteorological parameters are actually agreeing even on a day like this where we have some complex structure above with this mixed layer algorithm. So it seems to validate pretty well. We can start to build climatologies over LA, what mixed layer heights look like. You can see there's some systematic, this is box and whiskers plots over a course of more than a year. You can see it tends to, in spring is when we tend to see the deepest mix-in, and then it tends to fall sometime in summer, and it gets very noisy. And the very noisy is a point I want to emphasize. This is every day's maximum mixed layer depth every day over the course of more than a year. And what you see is there's just tremendous scatter and variability. Each day does not really give you a very good information on predicting the next day. And we really need to use this. So we're planning on using this in model frameworks. We can use this to pick out days the model seems to do better than others. We can maybe try and assimilate this into the models. But I wanted to quickly ask, can we be smarter? Can we do more? And really, can we reduce needed observations? Can we use more than just a parameterized mix-in layer height? So this is showing a profile made during CalNext. So this is in situ observations of methane in blue and aerosol in red. And you can see that they track well in the sense that the mixed layer seems to correspond as we expect. But if we zoom into that mixed layer, you see there's variability in the aerosol and in the greenhouse gas concentration, which correlates very well. And so we're starting to explore, maybe rather than just pull out mixed layer heights from aerosol profiles, can we actually start to infer structure within the mixed layer of how the greenhouse gases are distributed and use that to test and inform our models? So just wanted to quickly say that. Some points to remember I want to put up there. If there's only one thing you remember from the talk, I hope you remember that really this uncertainty in anthropogenic emissions, it's becoming really a fundamental science question. It is not simply a validation and policy question. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Eric. Got time for one question, and I see one over here.
Yes, sure. So the question, or more of a comment really, is that there's a lot of processes involved in mix and layer in LA with sea breeze in the mountains, and of course those are all important things for us to include and incorporate in our analysis and model and framework. Now, information on that is embedded within that data set, right? You can see really interesting features on things like residual aerosol layers that have rebounded off of the mountains, and so you can start to test your framework in a lot of other interesting ways. But yes, of course, that's very important.